Hey everyone, welcome back to Horsetooth Cinema. Today I'm going to be reviewing Vortex, which is the new film by Gaspar Noé. I've talked about Gaspar Noé a couple times on my channel. I think I talked about Climax in one of my videos and Irreversible as well. I've now seen all of his films except for his first film, I Stand Alone. And I have a little bit more perspective on his work. Gaspar Noé is known for being a practitioner and an advocate for extreme cinema. He's dealt with extremely taboo subjects in I Stand Alone. He's used a 10-minute rape sequence in Irreversible. He's shown many explicit sex scenes, unsimulated sex scenes in Love. And in Enter the Void, Climax, and Lux Eterna, he uses very experiential filmmaking to sort of induce the feeling of taking drugs into the viewer. I think a lot of people look at his work, especially his early work, and sort of dismiss it and by saying that he is just edgy for the sake of being edgy or inducing pain just for the sake of it. But with most of his films, for me, with the exception of Love and probably Lux Eterna as well, I think he usually really achieves something with that sense of pain. Climax, for all of its flaws, causes the viewer to feel a sense of enlightenment about the extent to which they have control over their surroundings and their state of consciousness. Noé sort of strips away that sense of control completely, and you feel like you're emerging from a very dark tunnel into the light. Enter the Void is a very long and a very nauseating experience, but it's a very interesting contemplation about the afterlife. You feel like after you watch it, you've sort of experienced an entire life cycle that will continue to go on forever. And Irreversible is a gruesome watch, one that I haven't dared to revisit since I first saw it. But it really has a lot of insight into how context affects narrative, using this sort of reverse storytelling structure. And it also exposes the flaws of the traditional revenge storyline by saying that the only real way that a revenge story can have a happy ending is if you tell it in reverse. But now he's sort of stepping away from that drug-induced, very taboo subject experience to something else entirely. Now he's trying to tell the story of a couple in their final days, one of which is stricken with dementia, the other with a heart problem. So after watching Vortex, I still think that Irreversible is probably his hardest film to get through for most people, and for myself. But I would say that Vortex is a very close second, actually. And I think it's just purely because of the subject matter and how difficult it is to, despite the simple premise of this elderly couple with dementia, it's just so hard to actually watch it play out. The film is 2 hours and 20 minutes long, and it definitely can feel overly long, I think. However, I'm not really sure what I would cut. That's kind of the problem, is if I were to go back in the film, there's not really any specific scene that stands out as, well, that's not really needed or anything. As much as I think it might be too long, I do think the runtime is actually a really effective tool to kind of put the viewer in the position of these people. Much like Enter the Void using runtime as a tool, it enhances the overall experience of what the film's trying to say. Enter the Void uses it for the kind of sense of existentialism, and Vortex does as well, but in a very different way, in a very depressing way. One of the things the film does to tell this story is that it uses a split screen technique for almost the entire film. There's an early scene of them laying in bed together, and you sort of notice this black line starting to come down the center of the screen, dividing them in two. And as they awaken and go on with their days, you sort of see how they exist in the same world, of course, but in completely different dimensions. The husband goes to work on his typewriter, she goes out to the store and just sort of wanders around the store looking completely lost, confused, and scared. That's sort of what I mean by a different dimension, is that of course they exist in the same space, but she is in a completely different reality than he is. There's moments as well when the split screens merge a little bit, and you can see maybe one of the characters sort of existing in both screens. And I thought maybe that this could represent a little bit of the normalcy that can occur if somebody has dementia. But that normalcy is always very short-lived, as we see the split screen sort of go back into the effect that it's used early in the film, and they sort of start drifting further and further away from each other. And I think depending on who you're drawn to more as a character, you might focus on one split screen more than the other, which is really interesting because then you can sort of go back and watch the film and maybe you see something different entirely. So for those reasons, for me the split screen, although it might seem a bit gimmicky, was much more than a gimmick. It was used very effectively to enhance this story. I think if you've ever had a loved one with dementia, you will very much connect to the performances in this film. Francois Lebrun's performance in particular finds a really good balance of, obviously clearly having dementia, but at the same time keeping the performance very grounded and real. One film I've talked about before, I think, on this channel is The Father, the Florian Zeller, Anthony Hopkins film, which deals with a very similar subject with him having Alzheimer's, and the film it uses a really interesting technique of confusing the viewer. But I think one area of the film that has sort of made me kind of think that the film has some issues is Anthony Hopkins' performance. Although I think he's good in the film, and I think he definitely sells the having Alzheimer's, I definitely think he's also a little bit over the top, and therefore it comes off as more of a performance than a person actually going through Alzheimer's or dementia. Whereas the performances in Vortex don't feel like that at all. They feel completely natural. It cuts really deep. And Dario Argento, I think, is also really good in the film. He's the audience character in a weird way, as he's sort of having to experience his wife's dementia the same way we are. But we see as the film goes on that it's really not that simple. I mean, yes, he is her caretaker in a lot of ways, and he is having to deal with the stress of, her descent. But he also has his secrets of his own. He has a bit more of a life on the side that she doesn't know about. And I think if you watch the film again, you'll definitely pick up on some hints that that might be the case before it's actually revealed. Apart from anything else I can say about the film technically, I think what really just impressed me about this is that I think it's a more mature film than anything else Noé has ever done. But it's still very much him. It's still very much a Gaspar Noé movie. For example, the way he approaches drugs is usually from the perspective of a young drug user. In Enter the Void, he kind of has a character that takes DMT. In Climax, the whole experience is based around this gimmick of this whole dance troupe takes sangria that's laced with LSD. But in Vortex, they do talk about the idea of drugs as well. So in the film, both characters have a 40-year-old son that comes and assists them, and he is a former druggie himself, and he still has a lot of younger, druggie friends. But one of the points the film makes about this is that the elderly woman is on way more drugs than any of those people, any of the current druggies that he still knows, just by the nature of her being old and having dementia, which is a very interesting juxtaposition, and I think it's a really real one. I think a lot of, old people definitely go through that experience. And it was kind of interesting for me because I've read a lot about what went into the making of this film. And after a certain event in his life, Noé himself stopped taking drugs, as he used to take them all the time, and they would give him inspiration for his movies. But yeah, he stopped taking them. And the way he looked at drugs in this movie with sort of, especially having that in mind, that he stopped taking drugs, it really is a very sober and, kind of sad perspective that he has. Sad in the sense of how it's dealt in the film, but sober in how Noé is sort of, taking this thing that has kind of, it's almost like a gimmick that's built his entire career, but using it in a very different, probably more intelligent way. The event in Noé's life that I'm referring to is that he almost died a year or two ago of a brain aneurysm, and as a result of that near-death experience, he decided to make this film. And there's a lot of ways in the film that you can really see that Noé himself has danced with death very recently. Probably the way that stuck out to me the most is that it really feels like this apartment is caving in on these two people, especially the woman. From her perspective, it's kind of a horror movie, just because she doesn't seem to recognize anything, and it all feels very claustrophobic when she's walking around her own apartment. It's very dark, very existential, as we're used to with Noé. But again, it's just more mature. I have only one issue with the film, really, and it's that the son, the 40-year-old son that comes and assists them occasionally, there's aspects of his character that just don't feel fully developed to me. Those plot points I mentioned with, his past with drugs, they feel a little bit more like plot devices that are used to tie in, his situation with his mother, who is now taking a lot of drugs, as opposed to a fully cohesive, plot device that serves the overall story. But it's really just little things like that. I mean, I think overall as a film, this works really, really well. So this isn't exactly a film that I can recommend to anybody. I think especially if this sort of thing, dementia, hits very close to home for you. If you've known somebody that's gone through this, then you might want to take that into account before you go see it, of course. But that idea of not being able to recommend it to everyone is very per usual with Noé. And I think if you really want to push yourself into, kind of dark places that will teach you something more about death and about sort of old age and our experience in life, I highly recommend this. For me, this is easily Noé's best film since Enter the Void. I think I definitely prefer it to Climax and definitely to Love and Lux Eterna. I'm gonna give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Anyway, that's my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, you can like it down below and subscribe to the channel. I've got more content coming out soon. Gonna hopefully be reviewing Alex Garland's Men and Top Gun Maverick really soon, as well as some other content, so you guys can stay tuned for that. I'll see you guys in the next one.